Eduardo is haunted by memories as he returns to a train station he's avoided for years. The weight of his past decisions, especially leaving Sarah, the woman he loved, crushes him. As the train arrives, Eduardo is paralyzed by fear and anticipation. Is she there waiting for him after all this time? His heart races as he sees her through the window. But will she step off the train? Time is running out, and one decision could change everything.
The sound of the train echoed in the distance, sharp and haunting, carrying with it memories that Eduardo had tried to bury long ago. As he walked towards the station, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his past was pulling him back, making him relive every choice, every regret. His hands gripped the brim of his worn-out hat, an anchor to the present that was rapidly dissolving in front of him. The station loomed ahead, just as it had all those years ago. Its old brick walls, the metal benches, and the clock tower, which had once signaled the beginning of his solitary journey, now seemed frozen in time. Eduardo had avoided this place for years, knowing that it held too much of what he had lost. Yet here he was, drawn back by something he couldn't explain. His eyes darted to the clock above the platform, the same one that had marked his departure so many years before. He remembered standing in this very spot, watching as the train took her away, Sarah. The name burned in his mind, a constant reminder of the choices he made, choices that led him to this moment. He sighed deeply, feeling the cool evening air brush against his skin. Eduardo knew he couldn't keep living in the shadows of his mistakes, but facing the past terrified him. What could he possibly gain from coming back here? Would she even remember him? And if she did, would she want to see him after all this time? Lost in his thoughts, he barely noticed the soft hum of an approaching train. It wasn't until the sound grew louder, closer, that he snapped back to reality. He turned his head just as the train rounded the bend, the same familiar whistle cutting through the quiet evening. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anticipation and fear flooding through him. He hadn't planned on this, on seeing her again. But something deep inside told him that she was there, on that train, heading toward this station, just as he had. The train screeched to a halt, and the platform filled with the mechanical hiss of doors opening. Eduardo felt rooted to the spot, his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen her in over a decade, yet he could feel her presence, the pull of their unfinished story. What would he say? Could he even muster the courage to approach her after all this time? Passengers began to spill out of the train, one by one, but Eduardo didn't see any of them. His eyes were fixed on the door of the second carriage, his heart racing. Was she there, behind those doors? Was this the moment fate had brought him back for? As the last of the passengers disembarked, Eduardo felt a wave of doubt wash over him. What if she wasn't there? What if this had all been a cruel trick of his mind, a desperate attempt to rewrite the past? He hesitated, taking a step back, when suddenly, through the window of the still open door, he caught a glimpse of her. Sarah. She was sitting by the window, her face half illuminated by the fading sunlight. She looked just as he remembered, no, even more beautiful than before. But there was something different about her now, a sadness in her eyes, as if the years had weighed heavily on her too. Eduardo's heart ached at the sight of her, and for a moment, the years of separation melted away. It was just them again, two souls tied by a love that had never truly died. The train's whistle blew again, this time signaling its impending departure. Eduardo's mind raced. If he didn't act now, if he let this moment slip away, she would be gone, again. And this time, it would be for good. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. It was now or never. Sarah sat in the train, staring out the window as the landscape blurred by, a mix of fields and fading sunlight that seemed to stretch on forever. But her mind wasn't on the view. It was on the heavy weight that had settled in her chest long before she boarded this train. She had hoped that leaving the city behind, moving forward with her life, would finally free her from the ghosts of the past. But no matter how fast the train moved, she couldn't outrun the memories. It had been over a decade since she last saw Eduardo. At first, she had tried to forget him, to erase every trace of their time together. But the truth was, she could never fully let go. Every corner of the city seemed to whisper his name, every quiet moment in her new life was filled with the ache of what they had once shared. He had left her without a word, his ambitions pulling him away, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a shattered heart. She had loved him deeply, more than she had ever loved anyone. And for a while, she believed he felt the same. But life has a way of twisting even the strongest bonds, and when the time came for Eduardo to choose between his dreams and their love, he had walked away. She had tried to move on, to build a life without him, but no matter where she went, his memory followed her, haunting her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Now, here she was again, sitting on a train, running from the past. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't running to escape the pain, she was running towards a new beginning. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Deep down, Sarah wasn't sure if a fresh start was even possible. The scars Eduardo left were still too raw, too deep. The soft hum of the train lulled her into a quiet daze, her fingers tracing the edge of the window absent-mindedly. She watched the world outside pass by, but inside, her mind replayed the moments she had shared with Eduardo, his laughter, the warmth of his touch, the way he had looked at her with such intensity. She had loved him fiercely, but love hadn't been enough to keep them together. And that reality still hurt. The train began to slow, and Sarah blinked, snapping back to the present. She hadn't been paying attention to the stops, too lost in her thoughts. As the train came to a halt, she glanced around the carriage, noticing a few other passengers gathering their bags, ready to disembark. It was just another station, another brief pause on her journey. But something felt different. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a strange sense of anticipation. It was almost as if something, or someone, was waiting for her at this stop. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling. She had spent too many years waiting for someone who never came back. She wouldn't make that mistake again. But then, as the doors opened and the cool evening air swept through the carriage, she felt it. That unmistakable pull. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes instinctively moved towards the window. And there, standing on the platform, was Eduardo. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen him in years, but there he was, just as she remembered. The sight of him was like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from her lungs. He looked older, more worn, but it was undeniably him. A flood of emotions surged through her, anger, longing, sadness, all tangled together in a confusing mess. What was he doing here? Why now, after all this time? She didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat as she watched him, frozen in place. For a moment, she thought he hadn't seen her, but then their eyes met. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them in that silent, charged moment. What was he thinking? Did he regret leaving her? Did he even care? The train's whistle blew, breaking the spell. Sarah flinched, torn between staying on the train and confronting the man who had once meant everything to her. The doors were still open, but they wouldn't be for long. Was this a sign? Was this her chance to finally get closure, or would opening that door again only lead to more heartache? The whistle blew again, louder this time, as the train prepared to leave. Eduardo's breath quickened as the train hissed to a stop, its doors sliding open with a mechanical groan. His feet felt heavy, rooted to the platform, but his eyes were locked on the window where he had seen her. Sarah was sitting just inside, her gaze cast towards the outside world. But the moment their eyes met, he knew she had seen him too. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. It was as though time itself had frozen, trapping them both in a liminal space between past and present. Eduardo's heart pounded painfully in his chest, and he was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of memories, of the way she used to smile at him, the laughter they had shared, and the arguments that eventually drove them apart. He had thought about this moment for years, imagined what it would be like to see her again. But nothing had prepared him for the intensity of actually being here, on this platform, with Sarah just a few steps away. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the edge of her seat, as if she was holding on to something, perhaps her resolve to keep her distance, perhaps the pain she had worked so hard to overcome. The train's whistle echoed sharply, snapping Eduardo out of his reverie. The doors wouldn't stay open forever, and Sarah, she looked like she was debating whether or not to leave the safety of her seat. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, and suddenly he found himself stepping toward the train, toward her. The few passengers who had exited the train brushed past him, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing on the platform. To them, it was just another stop, another ordinary evening. But for Eduardo, this was everything. He took a breath, the cool air stinging his lungs as he approached the open doors. From this distance, he could see her more clearly now. The way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, the same shade of brown that he remembered. She hadn't changed much. If anything, she seemed even more beautiful, though there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A sadness he knew all too well, because he had caused it. "Sarah," he whispered, though the sound barely made it past his lips. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but he knew she had heard. Her eyes flickered slightly, her grip tightening around the armrest of her seat. He wanted to call out to her, to say something, anything, that would break the silence between them. But what could he say? What words could possibly erase years of separation, of pain, of regret? His heart raced as he stepped closer to the doors, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to do something, had to say something before it was too late. But as he opened his mouth, the train's whistle blew again, louder this time, signaling that it was ready to depart. Eduardo panicked. If he didn't act now, he might never get another chance. His body moved on instinct, his hand reaching out toward the door as if that small action could somehow stop the inevitable. His fingers brushed against the cold metal just as the doors began to slide shut, and for a brief second, he thought it was over. But then, in a moment of clarity, Sarah stood. Her movement was quick, almost abrupt, and it took Eduardo by surprise. She grabbed her bag from the seat beside her, her eyes never leaving his. The doors paused, as if the universe itself was granting them one last moment before everything changed. For a second, Eduardo thought she was going to walk out, that she would step onto the platform and into his life again. His heart pounded with hope, a desperate, aching hope that this might be their chance to fix everything, to rewrite the story they had abandoned so long ago. But Sarah hesitated. Her gaze shifted, and he could see the conflict in her eyes, the same battle he had been fighting within himself, the anger, the sadness, the love that still lingered despite everything. She took a step forward, then stopped. The doors began to close again. The train jerked slightly as it prepared to leave, and Sarah took a step back, retreating into the safety of the carriage. Eduardo's heart sank. The realization hit him like a cold wave. She wasn't coming out. Not this time. The whistle blew one final time, and the train started to pull away from the platform. Eduardo watched helplessly as the distance between them grew, each second dragging her further from him. He stood frozen, his hands still outstretched, as the train disappeared down the tracks, taking with it the woman he had never truly let go of. For a moment, all that remained was the fading sound of the train and the echo of his regrets. He had lost her once, and now, it seemed, he had lost her again. The train's rhythmic clatter faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence on the platform. Eduardo stood there, staring at the empty tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. His hand dropped slowly to his side, the cold metal of the door handle now a distant memory. She was gone. Again. He felt a sharp pang of regret in his chest, a familiar ache that he thought he had buried long ago. For years, he had lived with the weight of his decision, the decision to leave her, to walk away from the one person who had truly understood him. And now, after all this time, fate had brought them back to the same place, only for him to watch her slip away once more. But something inside him wouldn't let go. Not this time. Eduardo's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He took off down the platform, sprinting toward the end of the station where the tracks curved into the distance. His heart raced, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't care. He couldn't let her go, not without trying. The sound of his shoes echoed against the pavement as he ran, his eyes fixed on the back of the train as it gained speed. The world around him seemed to blur, the station, the people, the sounds, all fading into the background as he focused on one thing, catching up to her. He didn't know what he would say, or how he would explain himself, but he knew he had to try. For once in his life, he had to follow his heart, no matter how foolish it seemed. As the train picked up speed, Eduardo felt a wave of desperation wash over him. He was falling behind, the distance between them growing with every step. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he pushed on. He wasn't going to let her disappear from his life again. In the distance, the faint glow of the train's rear lights flickered, teasing him with the possibility of one last chance. His mind raced, replaying every mistake, every word left unsaid. He had wasted so much time. All those years of pride, of putting his ambitions before love, had led him to this moment, running after the one person who had ever truly mattered. He could hear the faint sound of the train's whistle in the distance, signaling its approach to the next station. He was running out of time. Just as his legs were about to give out, Eduardo heard a sound that made his heart leap, the screech of the train's brakes. It was slowing down. A mechanical issue, maybe, or perhaps just another stop. Whatever the reason, it was his only chance. He pushed himself harder, feeling the weight of his exhaustion, but refusing to let it stop him. The train began to slow, and for a brief moment, Eduardo dared to hope. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe fate wasn't so cruel after all. As he approached the last car of the train, he could see the outline of the doors. His pulse quickened. Was she still inside? Would she even listen to him if he reached her? He reached the platform just as the train came to a halt. Eduardo's chest heaved with effort, his body trembling from the strain of the run. His vision blurred slightly, but through the haze, he saw her. Sarah, standing near the door, her hand resting on the metal handle as if she was unsure whether to step out or stay inside. Their eyes met again, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavy in the air between them. Eduardo wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. How do you ask for forgiveness for a decade of silence? Sarah, he finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse from the run. He took a step closer, hoping, praying, that she wouldn't turn away again. Sarah's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, sadness. But there was something else too, something softer, hidden beneath the layers of pain. She didn't speak, but she didn't move away either. Eduardo took another step forward, his chest still heaving. I never meant to leave things the way I did. I was a fool. Her grip on the handle tightened, her knuckles turning white. She looked down, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Why now, Eduardo? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why after all this time? The question hit him harder than he expected. Why now? Why after all these years had he come back? The truth was, he didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't live with the regret anymore. I don't have an answer, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. I've spent every day since regretting what I did. And now, I just need you to know that I'm sorry. The train's whistle blew again, a warning that time was running out. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with the weight of all their history, all their lost years. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Eduardo's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. As Eduardo stood there, breathless and vulnerable, Sarah felt herself torn between the present and the past, both crashing together with unbearable force. His apology hung in the air, thick and heavy, but her mind couldn't process it. Instead, it drifted back to the moments they had shared, moments that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. In a flash, Sarah was back in the small apartment they once shared, years ago. She could see Eduardo sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on some grand idea that was always out of reach. He had been consumed by ambition, constantly chasing success, constantly putting his dreams ahead of their relationship. She had loved him fiercely, admired his drive, but over time, she had grown weary of feeling like second place to his goals. Sarah remembered the nights spent waiting for him to come home, her heart aching with the hope that maybe, just once, he would choose her over his work. But that hope had slowly died as Eduardo became more distant, their conversations turning cold and strained. She had begged him to stay, to slow down, to see that they could build a life together without losing everything to his ambitions. But he hadn't listened. Instead, he had left her behind, chasing something that, in the end, hadn't been worth the cost. The pain of those memories hit her like a wave, and she struggled to keep her composure. Her hand tightened around the train's door handle as if it could somehow anchor her to the present, but the past kept flooding in. She could still hear the echo of his voice as he had said goodbye that day, standing on the threshold of their apartment, promising that he'd return, but never truly meaning it. Sarah blinked, forcing herself back to the present. She looked at Eduardo now, older, more worn, but still the same man who had broken her heart. His eyes were filled with regret, a regret she had dreamed of seeing for so many years. But now that it was here, now that he was here, she wasn't sure if it was enough. You always put your dreams first, Eduardo, Sarah said, her voice low but steady. I waited for you. I gave you everything I had, hoping you'd realize that what we had was worth fighting for. But you never saw it. You never saw me. Her words cut through the air, sharp and cold, and Eduardo flinched. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah wasn't done. The dam that had held back her pain for so long had finally broken, and everything she had wanted to say for years came rushing out. Do you have any idea how hard it was for me to watch you leave? She asked, her voice trembling now. I watched you chase a future that didn't include me. I told myself I could move on, that I could forget you, but I couldn't, Eduardo. I couldn't forget you, no matter how hard I tried. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. She had cried enough over him. She had spent years trying to heal the wound he had left behind, and now, standing in front of him, she wasn't sure if she wanted to reopen that wound or finally let it close for good. Eduardo swallowed hard, his chest tight with guilt. He had known he had hurt her, but hearing her words now, seeing the pain in her eyes, made the weight of his mistakes even heavier. I was wrong, Sarah, he said, his voice breaking. I was so focused on what I thought I needed to achieve that I lost sight of the most important thing, us. I see that now, but it's too late to take back what I did. He stepped closer, his hand hovering just inches from hers, as if afraid to touch her, afraid that she might slip away again. I don't expect you to forgive me, Eduardo continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But I need you to know that I've spent every day since regretting the choices I made. I thought I could build something on my own, but it's only now that I realize that nothing I achieved meant anything without you. Sarah looked away, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that he had changed, that he truly understood what he had lost. But another part of her, the part that had spent years rebuilding her life, was terrified of being hurt again. The train's whistle blew once more, a harsh reminder that time was slipping away. Sarah's grip on the handle loosened, and she looked at Eduardo, her mind spinning with uncertainty. Could she trust him again? Could she risk reopening old wounds for a love that had once meant everything but had left her shattered? I don't know if I can go through that again, Sarah said softly, her voice filled with the weight of years of heartbreak. I don't know if I can trust you, Eduardo. Eduardo's eyes filled with pain, but he nodded. I understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But please, don't walk away without giving us a chance to make things right. I'm not the same man I was. Sarah stood there, torn between the memories of a love lost and the possibility of a future she had never dared to hope for. As the train sat still on the platform, the hum of its engines low and steady, Sarah's mind raced. The soft whir of machinery and the occasional murmur from other passengers were drowned out by the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had never expected to see Eduardo again, let alone hear him apologize. Yet here he was, standing inches away from her, offering words she had longed to hear but feared would never come. Her heart was torn. She had spent years trying to forget him, to move forward with her life. But now, in this moment, she realized that the memories she had tried so hard to bury had never truly faded. They had only lain dormant, waiting for this moment to resurface. The train's whistle blew again, sharp and piercing, as if urging her to make a decision. The doors had started to close, and Sarah felt the pressure of time bearing down on her. She had only seconds left to choose whether to stay on the train or step off and face Eduardo, face the past she had tried so desperately to escape. Her body seemed to move on its own, her fingers releasing their grip on the handle as she took a step back into the carriage. The doors began to slide shut, and for a brief second, it felt like that was it. She would stay on the train, and Eduardo would be left standing on the platform, a ghost from her past. The train would move forward, and she would continue her journey, leaving him, and everything they had been, behind. But just as the doors were about to close completely, the train jerked to a sudden stop. The mechanical groan echoed through the station, followed by a low rumble as the lights flickered for a moment. The train had stalled. Sarah blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unexpected pause. She glanced at the other passengers, who looked around in confusion, their conversations quieted by the abrupt interruption. Outside, Eduardo was still standing there, his eyes locked on her through the window, a mixture of desperation and hope etched on his face. The universe, it seemed, had given them a few more moments. Moments that neither of them had expected, but that felt like they were meant to be. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned away from the window, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't how she had planned to leave things. She had boarded this train to escape, to start fresh, and yet here she was, standing on the edge of a decision she never thought she'd have to make. Eduardo's voice from moments ago echoed in her mind. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I've spent every day since regretting the choices I made. She had waited years for him to say those words, to acknowledge the pain he had caused, but now that he had, she wasn't sure what to do with them. Could she trust him? Could she risk reopening old wounds that had barely healed? Or was it better to leave things as they were, to walk away and protect herself from the possibility of more heartache? The train doors remained open, a silent invitation for her to step back onto the platform. The lights inside the carriage flickered again, and Sarah felt the pressure of the moment weighing down on her. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to choose, to either stay and close the door on the past for good or to step off and face the man who had once meant everything to her. Outside, Eduardo hadn't moved. He stood motionless, his eyes never leaving hers, as if willing her to step through the door and give them another chance. Sarah knew that if she stayed on the train, if she allowed the doors to close, it would be over. This brief encounter, this moment suspended in time, would be the last of them. But could she live with that? The whistle blew once more, louder this time, as the train prepared to resume its journey. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Slowly, almost instinctively, she moved toward the door. Her body acted before her mind could fully catch up, her feet carrying her toward the exit, toward the platform, toward Eduardo. As she reached the door, the train gave another lurch, the engine sputtering back to life, and the lights flickered once more. This was it. Sarah stepped off the train, her heart racing as her feet hit the platform. The cold air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the carriage. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the platform before they landed on Eduardo. He was standing there, just a few feet away, his expression one of cautious hope. His eyes searched hers, waiting, hoping for some sign that she was willing to let him back in. For a moment, they stood there, neither speaking, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like a heavy curtain. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, the unresolved emotions that had been simmering for years. The train hissed behind her as the doors finally closed, and the sound of the engine rumbling back to life filled the station. But Sarah didn't turn back. She stood on the platform, facing Eduardo, ready to face whatever came next. As the train pulled away from the platform, the sound of its engines fading into the distance, Sarah and Eduardo stood frozen, the world around them seemingly suspended. The bustling station, the distant hum of life, it all disappeared as they faced each other, their past hanging in the air between them like an invisible barrier neither could cross just yet. Eduardo took a hesitant step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He had imagined this moment for so long, the countless ways he would apologize, the things he would say to make her understand his regret. But now that she was here, just inches away, the words seemed inadequate. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, almost trembling, "I don't know what to say. I don't know if there's anything I can say to make up for what I did. I was selfish. I was blind to what really mattered, and I've regretted it every day since." Sarah listened, her heart pounding. The words hit her, but they didn't have the effect she had expected. She had waited so long to hear an apology, to hear him acknowledge the pain he caused, but now that it was happening, it didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined. There was too much hurt, too much time that had passed. The wounds, though scarred over, still ached. "You left me, Eduardo," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with pain. "You didn't just walk out of my life, you tore it apart. Do you even understand what that did to me?" Eduardo's face fell. He nodded, shame washing over him. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I hurt you, more than I can ever say. And the worst part is that I can't go back and fix it. All I can do is tell you how sorry I am." Sarah shook her head, stepping back slightly, creating more distance between them. "You don't just get to apologize and expect everything to be okay," she said, her voice rising with the frustration and sadness she had kept buried for years. "You don't just get to show up out of nowhere and pretend like you didn't break me." Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Eduardo flinched at the weight of them, but he didn't retreat. He had expected this. He had known from the moment he saw her again that this would be hard, that there would be no easy forgiveness, no quick resolution to the pain he had caused. "I don't expect things to be okay, Sarah," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to come here. I had to see you. I had to try, because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make it right." Sarah turned away, her eyes scanning the empty tracks where the train had disappeared. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Make it right? How do you make something like this right, Eduardo? You left me when I needed you most. You walked away without even looking back. And now, after all these years, you think an apology will change everything?" Eduardo's heart ached with every word she spoke. He had imagined this conversation so many times in his head, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. The anger, the hurt in her voice, it was more than he had anticipated. But he didn't blame her. He couldn't. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I can't erase the past, but I want to try to be the man I should have been back then. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sarah. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed, that I'm not that same man anymore." Sarah's shoulders tensed, and she turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes searching his, as if trying to see through the layers of time, of broken promises, of pain. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the hurt that had nearly destroyed her. And now, standing in front of her was the man who had caused it all, asking her to let those walls down. "I don't know if I can believe you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do I know this isn't just another mistake? How do I know you won't leave again?" Eduardo took a deep breath, stepping closer, but careful not to cross the invisible line that still separated them. "I can't promise you that everything will be perfect," he said honestly, "but I can promise you that I won't make the same mistake again. I'm here, and I'm not walking away this time. Not unless you tell me to." Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this time would be different. But the fear was still there, lurking in the shadows of her mind, reminding her of the pain she had endured. She had built a life without him, moved on in ways she never thought possible. Could she risk it all for a man who had once broken her heart? The silence between them stretched on, heavy and full of unspoken questions. The station around them remained quiet, the world outside their bubble of emotions feeling distant and far removed from this moment. I don't know, she finally said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I don't know if I can do this again. The silence between them was deafening. Sarah's words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty and pain. Eduardo stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for something, anything, that might give him hope. But the truth was, he couldn't blame her for hesitating. After everything he had put her through, how could he expect her to trust him again? I understand, he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. I don't blame you for not trusting me. I know I gave you every reason to doubt me, and I'll never be able to take back what I did. But I'm standing here now, Sarah. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw the depth of his remorse. He wasn't the same man who had left her all those years ago. He was different, older, more worn by life, perhaps even humbled by his mistakes. But despite everything, the fear still lingered, a constant reminder of the pain she had carried for so long. You say that now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But how do I know you won't change your mind again? How do I know that if things get difficult, you won't run away like you did before? Eduardo took a deep breath, the weight of her words pressing down on him. She was right. He had run away. He had chosen his ambitions over her, over their love, and it had cost him everything. The realization of that mistake had haunted him for years, and now that he was finally standing in front of her, he didn't have the luxury of pretending it hadn't happened. I was a coward, Eduardo admitted, his voice raw with emotion. I thought that if I chased my dreams, I could build a life that would make everything else fall into place. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. And by the time I realized it, it was too late. He paused, looking down at the ground as the memories of his past failures washed over him. I thought I needed success, recognition, something to prove that I mattered. But what I didn't see, what I was too blind to realize, was that the only thing that truly mattered was standing right in front of me the whole time. Sarah listened, her heart conflicted. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, the deep regret that weighed on every word. But that didn't make the hurt disappear. It didn't erase the years she had spent trying to put herself back together after he left. She had been strong, stronger than she had ever imagined she could be, but part of her had never fully healed. And now, here he was, asking her to reopen the wound. You hurt me, Eduardo, she said, her voice breaking. You left, and I had to figure out how to live without you. And I did. I found a way to move on, even when it felt impossible. But now I don't know if I can go back to that place. I don't know if I can let you in again, only to be hurt all over. Eduardo stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, but still respectful of the space she needed. His eyes were filled with pain, but also with hope. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Sarah. I know that. But I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed, a chance to prove that I can be the man you needed me to be back then. Sarah looked at him, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that people could change, that the man standing in front of her wasn't the same man who had walked out of her life all those years ago. But the scars were deep, and the fear of being hurt again was real. I don't know if I can trust you, she said softly, her voice barely holding steady. I don't know if I'm strong enough to go through that again. Eduardo's chest tightened. He could feel her slipping away, and it terrified him. He had come here thinking that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been lost. But now, standing on the edge of this fragile moment, he realized that it wasn't just about his feelings. It was about hers too, the hurt, the fear, the uncertainty she carried with her. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. Sarah, I won't leave again. I swear to you, I'm not that man anymore. I've spent too many years regretting my mistakes, and I can't live with myself if I lose you again. She looked away, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The pain in her chest was unbearable, and the weight of his words pressed down on her. She had been so strong for so long, and yet now, in this moment, she felt more vulnerable than ever. I don't know what to do, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know if I can open my heart again, Eduardo. Not after everything. Eduardo stepped forward, closing the last bit of distance between them. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his touch soft but filled with emotion. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, he said softly. I'm asking you to let me try. To let me show you that I've changed. That I'm not the man who walked away. Sarah looked down at their hands, her heart torn between the love she still felt for him and the fears that had kept her guarded for so long. Could she really risk it all again? Could she allow herself to believe that this time, things could be different? Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked down at their intertwined hands, Eduardo's grip gentle yet full of desperation. She had spent so long convincing herself that she didn't need him, that she had moved on, but here he was, making her question everything. The memories of their time together, both the good and the painful, flooded her mind, and for the first time in years, she felt truly unsure of the path she had chosen. She pulled her hand back, breaking the contact. The loss of his warmth sent a chill through her, but she needed space to think, to breathe. Eduardo's eyes followed her every movement, filled with a quiet plea, but he didn't push. He stood still, watching her, waiting. "I need to think," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to figure out what this means." Eduardo nodded, though his expression remained tense. "I understand," he said, his voice low. "Take all the time you need." But that wasn't true, was it? Time wasn't something either of them had in abundance. The train had already left the station, but another would come soon enough. Sarah would have to choose, stay here with him and face the uncertainty of rekindling something broken, or get on the next train and leave this chapter behind, once and for all. She turned away from him, her mind racing. The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Could she really trust him again? Could she risk everything she had built over the past decade to take a chance on someone who had once shattered her heart? The station around them was eerily quiet now, the distant sound of cars and city life muted by the intensity of the moment. Sarah could feel Eduardo's eyes on her back, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. If she did, she knew she might crumble, might fall into the comfort of the love she once had for him. And as much as she longed for that connection again, the fear of being hurt was too strong, too visceral. She thought about the life she had built after he left, the nights spent alone, the friendships she had formed, the strength she had discovered within herself. She had become someone new in his absence, someone independent and resilient. Would letting Eduardo back in mean losing that part of herself? But at the same time, there was something undeniable about his presence. Standing here with him, hearing the raw emotion in his voice, seeing the regret etched in his face, it stirred something deep inside her, something she had tried to bury but had never fully succeeded in hiding. Her mind swirled with questions, but none louder than the one that had haunted her since the moment she saw him on the platform. What if this time was different? What if he had really changed? She turned back to face Eduardo, her expression conflicted. He looked at her with a quiet intensity, as though he was bracing himself for whatever she might say next. "I don't know if I can go through it again," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I can survive if you leave me again." Eduardo's face softened, his eyes filled with guilt and understanding. He took a cautious step forward, but stopped short, keeping his distance. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve another chance. But I swear to you, I'm not going anywhere. I've learned from my mistakes. I see now what I couldn't see before." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had changed. Maybe the man standing in front of her wasn't the same man who had walked away all those years ago. But that hope was fragile, and Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to trust it. "I want to believe you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared. I'm scared that if I open myself up to you again, I'll end up right back where I was before, broken and alone." Eduardo's expression was pained, but he didn't flinch. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice steady. "I can't make up for the past, but I can promise you that I'll do everything I can to make sure you never feel that way again." Sarah closed her eyes, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm. She had come to the station expecting a simple journey, a one-way trip away from her old life. But now, everything felt so much more complicated. The choice before her was monumental, and no matter which path she chose, there was no guarantee of happiness or safety. The rumble of an approaching train broke the silence, the distant whistle signaling that her window to make a decision was shrinking. Sarah opened her eyes, staring at Eduardo, her heart torn between fear and longing. Could she walk away again? Could she board the next train and leave him behind, knowing that this might be her last chance to see if they could make it work? Or would she stay and risk everything for the possibility of a second chance, knowing that it might hurt even more if things fell apart again? The train's whistle grew louder, the sound like a ticking clock counting down the seconds. "Sarah," Eduardo whispered, his voice filled with emotion. She took a deep breath, her mind racing as the train came into view. The train approached the platform with a loud, shrill whistle, its arrival cutting through the tension like a blade. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the train slowed to a stop. The doors hissed open, a mechanical invitation to step forward, to leave, to escape. But her feet didn't move. She could feel Eduardo's eyes on her, waiting, hoping. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, each second feeling like a lifetime as she stared at the open doors. This was it, the choice that would shape everything moving forward. Sarah's chest tightened as the full reality of the decision hit her. The life she had built since Eduardo left was stable, safe, but there had always been an emptiness, a space in her heart that she could never quite fill. And now, with Eduardo standing before her, that space seemed to pulse with new possibility. Yet it was a possibility wrapped in uncertainty and fear of being hurt again, of reopening old wounds. The station was quiet except for the hum of the train and the soft shuffle of passengers boarding and disembarking. But for Sarah, it felt like the world had shrunk to just this moment, just this choice. "I can't ask you to make this decision lightly," Eduardo said, his voice breaking the silence. He stepped closer, but not too close, still giving her the space she needed. "But I need you to know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you get on that train, I'll let you go. But if you stay, I promise you, I'll never walk away again." His words washed over her, filled with a sincerity that tugged at something deep within her. The part of her that still loved him. The part of her that had never fully let go. Sarah's eyes flickered to the open train doors, then back to Eduardo. The memories of their time together, both the beautiful moments and the painful ones, swirled in her mind. She had built a life without him, but the thought of walking away now, of closing the door on him forever, felt like a finality she wasn't sure she was ready for. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her ears. This was it. The moment of truth. "I don't know if I can trust you, Eduardo," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can forget the way you left, the way you made me feel so alone." Eduardo's face tightened with emotion, but he didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her voice the fears that had held her back for so long. "But," Sarah continued, her voice steadier now, "I also don't know if I can walk away, knowing that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of possibility. Eduardo's eyes softened, a flicker of hope crossing his face, but he remained silent, waiting for her to make the final call. Sarah turned back to the train, watching as the last of the passengers boarded. The doors would close soon, the train would leave, and with it, her chance to move forward either with or without Eduardo. The whistle blew again, louder this time. The conductor's voice crackled over the speaker, announcing the train's imminent departure. It was now or never. Sarah's heart raced as she looked one last time at the open doors. Her feet shifted, and for a brief moment, she thought about stepping forward, about leaving everything behind and taking the safe, predictable path. But something inside her stopped her. She turned back to Eduardo, her decision made. "I'm not getting on that train," she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded with nerves. Eduardo's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't move. He didn't want to rush her, didn't want to risk breaking the fragile moment. Instead, he waited, his breath caught in his chest. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted, her voice softer now. "I'm scared of getting hurt again. But I'm also scared of what might happen if I walk away without giving us, another chance." Eduardo exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice full of emotion, "I swear to you, I won't hurt you again. I've learned from my mistakes. I know now what I didn't know before, that you are the most important thing in my life. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you if you'll let me." The train doors closed with a final hiss, the engine rumbling to life as it prepared to leave the station. Sarah watched it for a moment, feeling the finality of her decision settle in. But instead of fear, there was a sense of peace. A sense of hope. She turned back to Eduardo, taking a step toward him. "I'm not saying it'll be easy," she said, her voice firm. "And I'm not promising that I'll just forget everything. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give us a chance." Eduardo's eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something that felt like love. "That's all I've ever wanted," he said, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah smiled. It was small, tentative, but it was real. Eduardo reached out, taking her hand gently in his, and this time, she didn't pull away. This time, she held on. As the train pulled out of the station, Sarah and Eduardo stood side by side, their hands clasped together, watching the train disappear into the distance. It wasn't the end of their journey, far from it, but it was a new beginning, one filled with uncertainty, yes, but also with hope. And sometimes, hope was enough.